I'm LindaWokoun, and welcome to my demo. Today we're going to be painting a floral. I took this photo of a hollyhock on a recent trip to Chicago, and this is the painting that we're going to be working towards in this demo. We'll begin the painting with a loose wet into wet wash, letting colors mingle on the paper rather than on the palette. It's a really fun way to paint, and I hope you enjoy it. Our goal in the first step of the painting will be to maximize a sense of movement. And we do that by using a lot of gravity, picking the paint up and picking up the painting and moving it around a little bit. And also using a spray bottle. Any misting spray bottle will work. You don't want one like this where you get big droplets. You want one like this that provides just a mist. I happened to pick this one up on Amazon in the beauty supply section, actually. I think they use this for hairspray. So anyway, it works really well. Now, once we've done the underpainting, we've allowed it to dry, we're going to move into the negative painting portion of the demo. I know most of you are familiar with negative painting. For those of you who aren't, in negative painting, we define a subject by painting around it. So negative painting is all about silhouettes, and we use silhouettes to describe what's going on in the painting. Before we jump into the painting, I'd like to introduce a technique that I call rainbowing. Now, rainbowing is a way of allowing complementary colors to mingle on the surface of the paper and let them run into each other without creating a lot of neutrals or, in some cases, even mud. And we do that by using the color wheel. So it's one of those techniques that's easier to show you rather than try to explain it, so let me do that. Combining complementary colors in a wet into wet wash can be a little tricky. Let me show you. I've wet a little square here that'll serve as my wet into wet wash, and I picked up a little bit of ultramarine blue. And let's mingle that a transparent orange. I'm just going to push that right up next to the blue. And let's let gravity work its way a little bit. And you can see that where the two colors meet, we have a very soft transition, but it's also a very neutral transition. Now let's say I want to mingle these same two colors, but I want to avoid this neutral passage. And that's where rainbowing comes into play. I have an example here of a color wheel, and let's say I want to combine blue to orange. And instead of going directly, I work my way around the color wheel. I would go from blue to green to yellow to orange, or in the opposite direction, blue to violet to red to orange. Let me show you what that looks like. I've wet a square. I'll pick up my ultramarine blue. And instead of going straight to orange, I'll introduce a yellow. Gives it a bit of a green transition. From yellow, works beautifully with orange. Just working my way around the color wheel with analogous colors right next to each other. And you can see that even with these bright colors, just having that little bit of bridging yellow keeps the two colors separated enough that they remain vibrant, but you are still doing a wet into wet, soft-edged integration of two primary color or complementary colors. In today's painting, we're going to be flowing red into its complement green. So let me show you what that would look like with rainbowing. I've wet a square, and I'm going to pick up a warm red. And rather than go straight to green, I'm going to go to its complement, or to an analogous color, yellow. Again, that bridging yellow. And yellow works beautifully with green, so I can go straight from yellow. Here I have a sap green. And I can even intensify that red, as long as I've got that bridging yellow, and I have a soft transition going red to green. Now remember that I said you can go either way on the color wheel. So in this example, we went from red to green via yellow. But what if we were to go the opposite direction, from red to violet to a turquoise to a green? And that's actually the way the painting that we're going to be doing today. It's more of a cool dominance in the painting. And so let's try that. We'll go from our warm red, and instead of going straight to a yellow, let's go to a pinky red. In this case, it's not quite a violet. I think it's an opera. But transition to a violet. Again, a very an analogous color that's going to play really well with that pinky red. From purple, I can go to blue. And of course, blue is analogous to green and plays well, and I can go straight into green. So in this example, it's the same two colors, warm red into green. Here I went the warm route with the bridging yellow. Here I went a cool route with the bridging violet. Rainbowing works really well in all kinds of florals, and we have a couple of examples here. But it also works really well in architecture, as you can see at the roof line, and even in faces and portraiture. In our painting today, this will be our color strategy. We'll start with a warm red, and this I think is something called a geranium by Schminke, but a quinacridone coral or a scarlet lake, any transparent red works well. And then we'll bridge to a rose. From rose, we'll introduce some opera, again getting cooler. From opera to violet. Violet, we'll move to blue. To turquoise, starting to warm up towards green. And from turquoise to our sap green. So these are the colors that we're going to be using in the initial wash and flowing one into the other. Now, once we finish the wet into wet portion of the demo, we're going to be doing some negative painting, and we'll be using the same colors, but we might also introduce a perylene violet, which is a really warm dark, and also some burnt sienna, a yellow. This is New Gamboge. So here is our image, which I've drawn on a half sheet of watercolor paper. And you can see that I've masked a few areas to preserve the whites. I don't always like to use masking fluid, But in this particular case, we're using so much water and pigment that it's almost like pouring. And masking is actually, I think, essential to protect the white highlights. So jumping right in, I'm going to start with this upper left-hand quadrant. And because we're using lots of water, I'm going to have gravity, I'm going to try and get gravity to work in my favor. So I'm turning the painting upside down and actually at a bit of an angle. Wetting the area that I want for the initial wash all the way to the edges. I'm ignoring the edges of the flower that I've drawn. And I'm using a large mop brush. Now I'm going to switch to a smaller brush to load the pigment. And let's just begin right along the edge of that flower. And you notice I'm using quite a bit of pigment here. And just let it run. Now from that warm red, let's move to a rose along that edge. And we're going to rainbow our way into this outer passage. So I've got a rose beginning to do the bridging work for me to protect that vibrant red. From rose, I'm going to move to a violet. And just sort of use your brush to sort of mimic the veins of the flower. Continuing to load the violet. There we go. And I'm just going to start dropping in some blue where I have the violet. And again, still ignoring any of the lines on my paper. This is the Antwerp blue. Prussian would work just as well. And from blue, we can move into our green. Now, while the painting is still very wet, the surface is, I can use a smaller brush to load in some darker value. And this is just my darker rose color. And in the center of that flower, the values are very dark. So while I'm waiting for this section to dry a little bit, let's concentrate on this other upper area of the painting. I'm wetting it. So I'm going to start with a rose. And I'm going to leave a bit of a white separation, not much. And then from the rose to the violet. There we go. A little bit of blue. Flower. From blue to my turquoise. And from turquoise, we can move right into our green. Add in a little gamboge into that green. We're going to be doing quite a bit of negative painting here, so there'll be plenty of opportunities to add darks. Keeping it a little bit darker back behind that flower. Dropping a little more turquoise in this area. And I think we'll let that dry. Let's turn the painting right side up again and think about where we're going to move next. So let's move into this area. And here we're going to be doing quite a bit of rainbowing because we're going to have this flower petal just flow right into the leaves behind it. So I'm going to start with my red. And it's a warm red. And again, I'm ignoring my pencil lines. I don't care where the flower is ending. Now I'm introducing a little bit of opera to begin to cool things down. From blue, I can move to turquoise. And from turquoise right into green. While it's still very wet, I can deepen my rose in the center and just pull it straight out. Soften it a little bit, because at this stage, I still don't want any hard edges, and I'm not concerned at all if some of that pigment runs into the rest of the painting. So while we're waiting for this area to dry and settle down a bit, let's move to the upper portion of the next flower. And again, I'm wetting the area, going just up to the edge there. And I'm just sort of mimicking with my brush strokes the way that the flower naturally curves around. I'm going to switch to a little smaller brush here while I load in some darker pigments. And we're after. I'm just loading pigment. And as long as it remains fairly wet, and as long as I'm using a smaller brush and not adding a lot of extra water, I can avoid creating blossoms. And to soften, and while this is still a little damp, I'm just going to lightly mist. I don't want those edges to be quite so hard when we move into the next section. Now let's start to move down the paper here. And I'm wetting this next petal. And I'm even wetting back into areas that we've already painted, because again, I want to keep edges really, really soft. With my red, just let it run down the page. Some rose. Just keep it fairly warm in this area. From my violet to my blue. That red. From my blue to turquoise. And from turquoise to that green. A little more turquoise up under this top leaf. A little more green. And the edge of that leaf a little bit, so I'm going to drop in a little bit of gamboge. This gamboge will help soften the transition down into those lighter buds. And just give that a little bit of a squirt. So I'm going to transition into this lower petal here. And again, quite a bit of rainbowing because we're going to let that pigment flow all the way down the page. This petal I want to be a little bit lighter, and I'm going to introduce more yellow. So rather than bridge from red to violet to blue to green, I'm going to go the opposite direction on the color wheel, and I'm going to go from red to yellow to green. And that just gives me a little bit warmer, lighter look as I let these pigments run down into the leaf shapes. Bring in a little bit of that gamboge into these petals. And letting the gamboge run into the leaves. I'm going to darken the pigment a little bit more up in the center of that flower. Soften it. I can move directly into green. Just curving under this leaf in front and letting all of that just run down into those bud shapes. And I can take that green fairly far up into this leaf shape because I've got so much yellow up there. And I'm not going to run any risks of creating mud. Still plenty of blue. Yeah. Working at a fairly steep angle with my big brush again. I want to make sure I wet this area all the way down the paper and tuck it right underneath that petal. And just let it run. Drop in some blue. And you can see, even though we're still painting very wet into wet, we're beginning to define some of the leaf shapes with what I'll call just very loose negative painting. Add in some new gamboge in that bud area, and just let it run down. And I'm going to drop in some pink up in this area into the warm red. Back to my purple transition, because the leaves over on this side are going to be a little bit darker. So from purple to blue, and I'm just tucking in some blue under that forward leaf shape. Tuck this along with some sorry about the background noise. It looks like the landscape guys showed up on filming day. Dropping in turquoise here, and again just letting it flow down the page. And some more turquoise. As long as it's wet, I can keep adding. Maybe a little gamboge on this lower leaf. And now I'm just going to continue to add pigment. With my turquoise, and I have another leaf up here. And if you just let gravity and the pigment and your spray brush do the work, you can see we almost have the suggestion of leaves without actually painting them directly. I'm going to come back into this area under this leaf while it's still wet and add in more turquoise and just let it run. And back here behind the flower, I'm just going to tuck in a little bit of violet. And let that also mingle down the page. Adding more turquoise under this lower leaf, softening it a little with the spray bottle. Okay, I've added a little more blue down in this area and just let it run, keeping things very soft. Tucked a little more violet there in behind the petal there. But one of the things that I want you to observe before we move to the next stage of the painting is that I pretty much ignored local color. And while the leaves eventually get to a green, we go through a lot of pinks and purples on our way there. And when we get to the negative painting, hopefully what you'll discover is that it isn't color that defines the leaves, but rather their silhouette as we paint around them. So let's move to that stage next. I'm just working my way around these bud shapes and roughly matching the color that's behind. I've zoomed in a little bit so you can see as we move into some of the more detailed areas in this bud cluster. I'm going to start painting around individual buds. And I'll keep this edge hard where I'm trying to define the bud, and then I'll soften on the other side of it. And I may, at this point, start to introduce a little burnt sienna. The spaces in between the buds are what's called a captured negative. Now, what's a captured negative? I just painted one. It's usually a small space where the edges are hard on all sides. So I'm going to keep on working my way around these bud shapes and using primarily captured negatives. Even though I haven't drawn additional buds back here, I can just create one by painting around my imaginary little bud here. And just walking the pigment out away from it. I'm going to continue to work in this area and may fast forward a bit. And I'm still wet into wet here, so it's still fairly loose. But I'm suggesting the shapes of the things that are about to come. Moving into blue. Up in this area, I want to keep it loose. But as I get down towards the edge of that leaf shape, I want to keep that back edge very soft, so I'm using the spray bottle. And now I'm tucking some dark color underneath this leaf shape and starting to provide the background for these buds. And here I'm painting wet into dry because I want to be able to control my edges a little more as I get into these bud shapes. Let's start. So I'm going to move up into this area, and there's a leaf right on top of these other two that I'm going to start to define. And I may take some of this color, some pink, back up into the flower a little bit. And really putting this at an angle, just letting things run. This is still pretty wet. And there's a leaf tucked back here behind this one in front. And using my turquoise, just going to very softly define those edges. Bit of pink, just kind of wrapping around in the same way that the petal shape moves. But because I'm moving into a yellow area, I don't want to take that purple down into that. So I'm going to bridge with a little burnt sienna. And that will provide enough dark to define the edge of that leaf shape without muddying my yellow. And again, let the spray bottle help us out a little bit here. I want to keep the transition into this area still fairly loose. So I'm dropping a little red into that leaf shape and then just letting it run into the leaf below, sort of forming the vein of this lower leaf. And just spray it to keep it soft. And there's another leaf tucked back in here. I'm just defining that edge and softening it. Maybe some of that burnt sienna. I'm just defining this little leaf here with some burnt sienna. And I'm going to pull some of that color up into the flower and sort of let it run into the area where we outlined the leaf. While this portion is drying, let's move over into the bud area and start to do some of the negative painting in the same way that we did up at the top. I have a leaf shape here that's kind of in front, so let's just pull that out along with its stem and provide some background. Move from turquoise into green. And now we're going to work our way around and define the stems and leaves and the buds that we talked about earlier. We have a lot of negative painting in this area, so I'm just going to speed up the video a little bit while we work our way around this bud area, adding darks and captured negatives. And just to keep things a little unified, I might actually drop in just a suggestion of red down in these buds. As we're getting farther into the negative portion negative painting portion of the painting, now is as good a time as any to start removing the masking fluid. And the other thing that's important is, as you can tell as I'm removing this, the whites from the masking fluid are really, really stark. As we do more negative painting, we're also going to take some time to soften all of these hard white lines and integrate them with the flower and the leaves and the buds. So to soften the edges, the white where the highlights are, I use what I call my masking fluid brush. It's a flat, fairly stiff bristles, but I don't use this end to put the masking fluid on. I use this end, which is just plastic. The masking fluid comes off really easily. I get a nice sharp line, and it's very easy cleanup. I use this end for lifting and softening the areas where the masking fluid was. And let me show you how that works. I'm just wetting along the edges and letting some of that color run back into the white. And I might extend that white just a little further. I'm going to add a little bit of yellow to some of these highlight areas that we've softened after removing the masking fluid, and it just gives a little bit of a bit warmer look to some of the highlights. Also adding yellow to these central stamens, burnt sienna underneath those stamens to provide some of the shadow. Dropping in yellow in the light areas of the stamens on the lower flower. There are some captured negatives underneath the flower here that help define the leaves and their stems. A couple more negatives down in this area. Pulling some of this red further into these leaves. Doing a close-up of some of the detail in this lower leaf area here. I'm just coming in with a darker value of the same color that I'm painting over, or pretty close. Same combination of colors anyway. And I decided to pop in a couple of extra buds up in this area. And this one shape, but defined this upper leaf, this leaf, and these bud areas. Some more stems and flowers down here. And I'm just going to be working my way around the painting, finding areas where we have an opportunity to just add some depth and some definition with negative painting. A couple of rules about negative painting is you always want to start painting around the subject that is closest to you. And that's kind of what we're doing in these areas with that forward bud and those stems. The other thing to keep in mind is that you also want to go about 2 or 3 values darker with the color that is already on the page. I'm also going to re-wet this area below the leaves and go maybe a shade or 2 darker. The area that I'm painting into is, as you can see, very, very wet. And I'm just going to let the video speed up through this portion and just let you see how the paint moves across the paper. While this area is drying, I may want to pop in a couple of leaves in the background here. And again, I'm doing it with negative painting. And I'm just defining a leaf here by painting around it. We have a few more leaves tucked up behind these buds. And again, I've just sort of invented these to take one more layer back in our negative painting, just painting around these leaves. It's fun with each layer that you go back. You just get such great depth. And let's add a few more leaves down here, sort of tucked under these forward leaves. And perhaps some more over here. And in this area, we're just painting that next layer of leaves behind the first set of buds there. And it's lots of small negative shapes, but we're defining a sort of a second cluster of leaves back here. So we'll just let the video speed through this part and you can see how it develops. Negative painting can be almost intoxicating. You can just kind of get lost in this for hours, going back layer after layer, adding more detail. And there's really no limit to how far back into a painting you can go by just going a couple of shades, a couple of values darker, and defining more subject matter. It's what makes it fun,
and also a little challenging.
I think I want to define maybe just part of the upper edge of this flower here. So I'm going to rainbow it, just a darker shade of that pink. And then adding the blue. Maybe some purple. We're getting close to the end here. There's just a couple of more captured negatives, the little holes that separate the petals. And on this flower, I think we're closing in on a finish. Before we make that final determination, I want to try a matte on it first and see if there's anything that we might want to change or adjust once we've seen it with a clean white matte. And I think we're pretty close. To review, we started our painting by rainbowing, first dropping in red, moving to violet, then to blue, and then adding green. And we used that same technique throughout the painting, moving our way around and down the paper. Once we completed the wet into wet rainbowing wash, we moved on to negative painting. After the first negative painting pass, we removed the masking fluid and began to soften the edges before we made our final pass at negative painting. Again, I'm LindaWokoun, and I hope you enjoyed this demo. Thank you for watching, and please enjoy the rest of the convention.